The air was sharp with winter. The kind of cold that pressed against the windows and made the furnace hum through the night. I was folding towels in the small laundry alcove off the kitchen, steam rising from the dryer, when I heard voices drift down the hallway. At first, I didn't pay attention. It was common for Maribel and her husband, Kent, to talk late, their words carrying into corners of the house I had paid for, but never truly belonged to. Then her voice sharpened, clear enough to slice the air. Honestly, the greatest gift this Christmas would be if she just died. I froze. The red towel in my hands slipped to the floor, a bright blot against the linoleum. For a moment, I convinced myself she meant someone else. Maybe a character from her office gossip. Maybe an old neighbor. But Kent's low chuckle answered, and silence followed. The kind of silence that told me there was nothing casual in her words. I moved quietly back to my suite, the place they called generous but never let me decorate, where the walls were bare and the door had no lock. My knees trembled as I sat on the edge of the bed. I tried to breathe, but each inhale felt thin, brittle, as if the air itself had betrayed me. Later, when the house was still, I opened the filing cabinet in my room, searching for the old folder where I kept stray bills and tax slips. Buried in the papers was a draft insurance policy I didn't remember signing. My name, once typed neatly on the beneficiary line, had been scratched out in ink. Beside it, in Maribel's tidy cursive, was her own. The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the desk to keep from falling. It wasn't only her words now, it was proof. My death wasn't just a passing wish. It had been planned for, calculated, waiting like a ledger line in their accounts. I closed the folder carefully, slid it back into place, and sat in the quiet. The furnace rumbled. The Christmas tree lights flickered faintly down the hall, and all I could think of were the years I had given to raise a daughter who now measured me in dollars and signatures. I pressed my hands together, steadying them. Somewhere deep inside, something that had been dormant for years began to stir, carrying me toward the memories of everything I had sacrificed to keep her alive and thriving. I couldn't sleep after finding that folder. The words, the signature, the casual cruelty of it all, they circled in my head like crows. I closed my eyes and tried to drift, but instead, the past came flooding back, uninvited and relentless. There was a time when my life had felt wide open. At 19, I held an acceptance letter to an art school in Paris. I used to trace the name of the city with my fingertip, as if touching the word could carry me there. But then Thomas came along, steady and kind, and together, we built a life in Massachusetts. I told myself Paris would wait. It never did. When he died suddenly, I had a 5-year-old and a stack of medical bills. Dreams folded away quickly when rent was due. I took shifts anywhere I could find them, waiting tables, cleaning houses, even sewing hems for a dry cleaner who underpaid me but paid on time. Nights blurred into mornings, my hands raw from scrubbing, my back aching from hours on my feet. But Maribel had shoes that fit, lunches packed, and birthday cakes with candles. That was enough. Years later, when she and Kent wanted a house but couldn't secure the loan, I sold my own, the little Cape Cod Thomas and I had bought together, filled with memories of crayon drawings on the walls and summer barbecues on the lawn. I let it go. I wired her $150,000. The nest egg I thought would carry me into old age. She hugged me then, her eyes shining. "You'll always have a place here, Mom." I believed her. Now I sat in this narrow suite, my world reduced to beige walls and a bedspread I hadn't chosen. No lock on the door, no photographs on the dresser. I lived like a tenant in a house my sacrifice had built. I pressed my palms together, fighting the hollowness rising in my chest. Memories of scraped knuckles, sleepless nights, and abandoned dreams pressed against me, demanding to be felt. And in that pressure, I began to see patterns I had ignored, threads that led to something darker waiting to be uncovered. The longer I sat in that bare little suite, the more my thoughts tangled into questions I didn't want to ask. Memories began to resurface. Moments I had brushed aside, moments that now refused to stay quiet. I remembered Maribel sliding papers across the kitchen island, her tone brisk but sweet. "Just sign here. Mom, it's routine, easier if everything's in one place." I never asked many questions. I told myself it was efficiency, a daughter helping her aging mother with the endless grind of forms and accounts. Trust was supposed to be a mother's default posture, but now I replayed those scenes with sharper eyes. Her hand hovering just a second too long, guiding the pen, my signature appearing where I barely remembered writing it. Her quick movements to tuck the papers away before I could read them through, doubt pressed heavy against my chest. Had I been signing more than permission slips and utility transfers? I pulled out the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept a mess of unopened envelopes and old correspondence. My fingers shook as I sifted through yellowed statements. There, among the ordinary bills, were letters addressed to banks I'd never dealt with, accounts I didn't recall opening. Some bore my name in looping ink, but the strokes weren't mine. The signature was too neat, too careful, a practiced imitation. My stomach clenched as I traced the forged letters. Maribel hadn't just taken my money. She had taken my name, my identity, the last shield I thought was mine alone. Each document was another quiet theft. Years in the making. I stacked the letters on the desk. A small tower of betrayal. My heart beat heavy in my ears, but beneath the shock, a new current began to run through me, not grief this time, but resolve. These papers weren't just scraps of proof. They were keys to a truth I had ignored for too long. A truth I was finally ready to face, and somewhere in this house, hidden in an old suitcase, I knew there was something else waiting to be found. I pushed aside the pile of forged letters and walked to the closet. At the very back, beneath folded blankets no one ever used, sat a battered suitcase I hadn't opened since the week Thomas died. Dust clung to the zipper, and for a moment I almost left it shut, afraid of what grief might spill out if I disturbed it. But my hand moved anyway, steady in a way it hadn't been all night. Inside, beneath a layer of old sweaters that still faintly smelled of cedar, was a long white envelope. On the front, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were two words, Plan B. My breath caught as I slid it free. He had always been cautious, always thinking ahead for both of us. I had forgotten, or maybe I had chosen to forget, that he left me with more than memories. I broke the seal carefully. The first page was the deed to this very house. Co-ownership notarized. My name etched there as firmly as Maribel's. Behind it were signed agreements. Paperwork Maribel had never filed. Legal loose ends she had dismissed as not worth the lawyer's fees. 40%. That was my share. Still mine. The discovery did not shatter me the way her words had, nor hollow me like those forged signatures. It steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt something other than helplessness. Power pulsed quietly in my hands, folded between old pages Thomas had insisted we keep safe. I pressed the envelope flat on the bed and whispered his name. It felt like he was there beside me, reminding me that I wasn't entirely at their mercy. The silence in the room shifted, no longer oppressive but charged with a quiet certainty. And as I tucked the envelope close, I knew it was only the beginning of what I was meant to uncover. The house buzzed with the usual December chaos. Maribel was draping garlands over every doorway, snapping photos on her phone before adjusting the angle of the ribbons. "The light has to catch just right," she muttered, more concerned with likes than with the children's laughter. I stayed in the kitchen, rolling dough and cutting shapes for the grandchildren's cookies. Flour dusted my sleeves, and for a brief moment, the simple act of baking steadied me. But voices carried easily in this house. From the living room, I caught the low rumble of Kent's voice. If we used her social, the approval would go through faster. Maribel's reply was sharp, practiced. She wouldn't even notice. Half the mail ends up in her drawer unopened. My hands froze above the tray. They weren't whispering. They weren't ashamed. They were planning. When the cookies were in the oven, I slipped outside to the mailbox. The cold air stung my cheeks. But the sting was nothing compared to what waited inside the metal box. Envelopes with unfamiliar logos. Balances past due. Collection warnings, each addressed partly to me. My name tied to debts I had never made. Numbers that screamed of someone else's desperation. I carried the stack back to my suite, spreading them across the desk beside Thomas's envelope. The contrast was unbearable, his careful foresight against her reckless greed. The cracks I had tried to plaster over for years now yawned open, showing me the rot beneath the surface. I sank into the chair, tracing my finger over the bold print final notice. A hollow ache spread through me. But behind it came something harder, sharper. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't carelessness. This was theft, deliberate and ongoing, wrapped in the excuse of family. The oven timer dinged faintly down the hall, but I didn't move. I sat in the growing stillness, staring at the pile of bills, the proof of how far she had gone, and somewhere deep inside, resolve began to take shape, pointing me toward the next step I knew I had to take. I couldn't look at another envelope without feeling sick. So I turned to the one place I still believed was mine, alone, my emergency account. The login screen blinked, asking for credentials I hadn't typed in months. My fingers shook as I entered the password. And when the numbers appeared, my chest tightened. Barely $2,000 remained. I scrolled through the history withdrawal after withdrawal, small enough to avoid suspicion, but steady enough to bleed the account dry. The betrayal felt different this time. Not just ink on a page or whispers in another room. This was my lifeline. The one thing Thomas had made me promise to keep untouched, except in true crisis. And now it was gone. Siphoned away without even the decency of an explanation. I pulled the latest mortgage letter from the pile on the desk. The words blurred at first, but then came into focus 3 months past due. Risk of foreclosure. My name sat right beside Maribel's. My credit, my history, my very identity bound to her carelessness. My eyes wandered to the small jewelry box on the dresser, the one that once held Thomas's watch. I had sold it 2 years ago when Kent's business deal collapsed, their voices frantic on the phone, begging for help. I remembered walking out of the pawn shop with cash in my pocket and a hole in my chest. I had told myself it was what Thomas would have wanted for me to keep the family afloat. But standing there now, with the weight of forged signatures and drained accounts pressing down on me, I knew he would have said no. He would have told me enough was enough. The rage burned steady, but beneath it was something clearer. Resolve. I would not sell another piece of memory. I would not cover another bill. For the first time, I would let the consequences fall where they belonged. I closed the laptop gently, the glow fading into darkness, and felt the shift inside me harden into decision. It was time to prepare what came next. On Christmas Eve, the house smelled of pine and cinnamon, but the sweetness only made the bitterness in my chest sharper. The children were upstairs, their laughter muffled by doors, while Maribel fussed over the table setting as if the perfection of a napkin fold could erase the cracks beneath our roof. I slipped quietly into my suite, shut the door, and opened my laptop. The first task was simple log into the accounts and cancel every automatic payment tied to my name. Each click felt like a small liberation, untying knots that had bound me for too long. Gas, electric, water, mortgage line by line. I severed myself from their debts. The screen confirmed the cancellations, and I sat back in the chair, breathing slowly, letting the finality sink in. Then I picked up the phone and called Sophia, the lawyer Thomas and I had trusted. She didn't ask questions at first, only listened as I laid out the details: the deed, the overdue notices, the forged documents. Her voice was steady, almost clinical, but I caught the undercurrent of indignation on my behalf. "You're protected," she said firmly, "and you're well within your rights. For the first time in weeks." I felt something like safety. I gathered the copies from Thomas's envelope, slid in the mortgage letters, and wrote a single line in my own hand. This house was a gift. So was I. You lost both. I folded the papers into a plain envelope and addressed it simply, Maribel. The living room glowed with the pale blue light of Maribel's open laptop. I placed the envelope beneath it, the corner peeking out just enough to catch her eye. For a moment, I stood there, watching the tree lights blink across the glass ornaments, and felt the strangest calm. I turned, walked back down the hall, and closed my door softly behind me, already knowing that the next time it opened, I would be leaving with only what I chose to carry. The night moved slowly, as though the walls themselves knew I was leaving. I laid an old suitcase on the bed, the same one I had once carried on my honeymoon. This time, I packed differently, not with hope for a shared future, but with the essentials of a life reclaimed. 2 sweaters, a coat, sensible shoes, a worn passport tucked into the side pocket. Nothing that could be mistaken as theirs. Nothing that tied me to this house any longer. On the desk, I arranged 3 small boxes wrapped in plain brown paper. Each held a letter for a grandchild, words written carefully by lamplight memories of bedtime stories, afternoons in the garden, quiet reassurances that none of this was their fault. I told them I loved them without condition, that love would follow them long after I was gone. No goodbyes, only reminders. When the first light of dawn brushed against the curtains, I zipped the suitcase and lifted it to the floor. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the hallway clock. I walked slowly through the rooms, each step both heavy and freeing. At the tree, the lights still blinked, stubborn against the dark, but their glow felt foreign now, belonging to someone else's Christmas. I slipped out the front door, careful not to let it slam. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that catches in your throat, and soft flakes of snow drifted down, settling on the driveway. The shuttle pulled up just as I reached the curb, its headlights cutting through the pale morning. The driver stepped out, took my bag, and asked nothing. As I climbed aboard and the door shut behind me, I looked once at the house, its roof dusted white, its windows dark, and then turned away. Paris awaited, and I was finally ready to meet it. Paris greeted me with a hush I hadn't known in years. In the small apartment a friend of Thomas's had arranged, I unpacked only what I needed and left the rest in the suitcase, as if keeping proof that I could leave again if I wished. The first night, I slept without fear of footsteps outside my door. By the 3rd morning, the emails began. Notices from the utility company's unpaid balances, disconnection warnings, then the mortgage company account in default, foreclosure proceedings imminent. My name was still there beside Maribel's, but this time, I read it without panic. The lawyer had already confirmed my share was safe, protected. Their collapse would not drag me with them. The calls came next. Dozens of missed calls flashing across my phone. Maribel's name lighting the screen again and again. I let them ring out. But one voicemail I played just once her voice shrill with panic, insisting I was confused, that I must be mentally unfit, and someone needed to intervene before I made mistakes. The attempt was pathetic, easily dismissed by Sophia when the paperwork proved I was more than capable. I brewed tea in the narrow kitchen and carried it to the window. Outside, the Eiffel Tower glittered against the winter sky, its lights winking like a private reassurance. I sipped slowly, warmth spreading through my chest, and let the sound of the city below remind me that life carried on, indifferent to betrayal. Their world was unraveling back in Massachusetts, thread by greedy thread, and I was no longer the one holding it together. For the first time in decades, I felt the sweetness of watching something fall without needing to catch it. I set the cup down gently, already knowing what I would write in my journal that night. That evening, I opened the small notebook I had bought at a corner shop near the Seine. Its cover was plain, but the blank pages felt like a gift waiting to be claimed. I sat at the narrow table, pen poised, and let the words come. I didn't just walk away. I walked toward the girl I used to be. The sentence looked fragile at first, but as I read it back, it steadied me. Paris had been my dream long before I became a wife, long before motherhood consumed every piece of me. Thomas once promised we would come here together when the time was right. Life never gave us that chance, but here I was at last, carrying both his memory and my own unfinished story. From the window, I could see the lights shimmering across the river. For years, I had measured myself by sacrifice, by how much I gave, how much I endured, how much I allowed to be taken in the name of family. But sacrifice without respect was just another word for erasure. I wrote again, slower this time, carving it into permanence. Love without respect is not love, it's debt. I am done paying. I closed the notebook gently, slid it beside the teacup, and let the silence of the apartment wrap around me. For the first time in decades, it wasn't the silence of being unwanted, it was the silence of peace. Tomorrow I would walk the streets, maybe visit a gallery, maybe sit in a cafe where no one knew my name. Tonight, it was enough to know I had chosen myself, at last. And with that choice, I felt the future open, vast, unclaimed, and finally, mine.